Well, now turning our sights across the Channel. This morning, France's President Macron has awoken to an uncomfortable election result. The recently re-elected president was hoping to win a majority in the National Assembly in order to deliver on his agenda, of course. Yet last night, his centrist coalition took a hammering from both the left and the right. While still the largest bloc in the National Assembly, Macron-affiliated Ensemble, it's the only bloc to include an exclamation mark in their official name, it's down by almost 100 seats compared to the previous election. Let's take a look at what happened. Back in 2017, Macron swept to power not only in the presidency, but also 2 months later in the legislative elections. His group won 350 out of 577 seats, a large majority. Marine Le Pen's party won just 8 seats. They're represented, for those watching on television, in the tiny little dots in black on the right there. And the left-wing MPs won 58 seats. Well, this time around, it's very, very different. This time around, while some sources differ on the early numbers, the result is nevertheless clear. Macron's affiliates are down to 245 seats, over 100 lower than their 2017 total. Le Pen, meanwhile, has grown from 8 to 88, an enormous rise in her vote. And the hard left bloc, led by Marxist firebrand Jean-Luc Mélenchon, have scored 131 seats, well up on the total won by the parties within this new bloc last time around. Well, what does this mean for France? Joining me now is French journalist Nabila Ramdani. Well, thanks for joining me, Nabila. It's really good to have you on the programme. I suppose, first of all, this is going to be a challenge for Macron. He's going to have to make friends in order to govern. What are his options?
Well, good morning, Tom, and thank you for having me. As you quite rightly said, on the face of it, this is a pretty disastrous result for Emmanuel Macron. He's just been elected president for the second term, and for the least he would get is a reasonable working majority of 289 seats out of 577. But even the centrist coalition that he built, Ensemble, together, failed to achieve that. And as you quite rightly said, his alliance is on more or less 240 seats at the moment. I mean, the projected results are pretty accurate at this stage. They reflect 95% of the counted votes. So 240 seats at the moment also in the National Assembly, which is the equivalent of the House of Commons. Remarkably, you highlighted the gains of the far right, historical gains for the far right, and also the far left, the coalition of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which achieved massively successful results this time around. It has to be highlighted that the president's own ministers today described his failure as a democratic shock, and they said it could hinder the capacity to block the president to indeed reform and indeed to protect the French. It has to be said as well that the French papers are particularly damning. I mean, you've got the headlines in the Economics Daily, Les Echos, who called it an earthquake, while the left-wing Libération paper said it was a slap for Mr. Macron. And the last time a newly elected head of state failed to get an outright majority in parliamentary elections was in 1988, when the socialist François Mitterrand was forced into what is called a cohabitation with the conservative prime minister. So what does this mean for Macron, and will he be able to govern? Well, the situation means that Macron will have to rely on other parties to get his legislation through. He had avoided that possibility so far, but he will now have to forge new alliances. Remember
I suppose
yes.
The question there is, who will he try to work with? There's the very far left bloc, which is made up of some other parties, some smaller ones within it. Will they split? It would be extraordinary if he were to work with Marine Le Pen's group. There's also Les Républicains, who have gone down by a considerable number, but the sort of centre-right party there, they could be a potential partner. Who will Macron seek to work with in order to try and get an agenda of any kind through?
Well, Macron has always made it clear that he would avoid working with the extremes. And what he means by the extremes, they include the far left coalition headed by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. He created the NUPES group, which stands for New Popular Social Union of Ecology. It's effectively a left-wing coalition of different groups, socialists, communists, Greens, and the like minority groups on the left. And there's also the other extreme, the far right of Marine Le Pen, the National Rally, which is not a consideration at all for Mr. Macron. Remember that Macron is seeking to push quite radical legislation, especially in financial terms. He wants to bring in legislation that he knows will annoy a lot of French people, business-friendly legislation, for example, to increase the retirement age from 62 to 65, or bring in policies that will make it easier for bosses to hire and fire people. So his most likely alliance to achieve that would be to turn to Les Républicains and other centrist minority groups like the UDI or the DVD. They're his most natural allies. But there's no guarantee at all that, I mean, they are for the moment projected to gain 78 seats, so that would get him over the line to push through his radical legislation. But if there's no possible alliance even with those groups, then Macron might have to seek to make a deal on a bill-by-bill basis. And if the paralysis continues, nevertheless, then Macron may even have to call another snap parliamentary elections. But I think one important point, however, to bear in mind is that the president remains the most powerful institution in France by far. Macron is fully aware that the system allows him actually to bypass parliament in many areas of government. And he's already resorted to ruling by decrees in his previous administration. And he can do that pretty much instantly. He can even appoint much of his government from outside of parliament. Remember that his prime minister, before the current one, Jean Castex, who was a civil servant, for example, Emmanuel Macron himself has never been an MP himself. And that would surprise a lot of your viewers because it just shows how different the French system is to the British one.
Really different, but a very unstable or unstable time, I suppose, coming up in the next few years in French politics. Just a final point in this conversation. It's been extraordinary, the demise of the centre-left in recent years. The president who preceded Macron, Hollande, was a member of the Socialist Party, the centre-left party. And now that party has sort of been absorbed into this bloc of extremists. What on earth has gone on with the centre-left in France?
Well, yes, indeed, that's quite a notable development in French politics. And I think Mr. Macron himself has a lot to do with the demise of the centre. He came in as somebody who branded himself as an independent. So he took as many votes as possible from the centre-right and indeed from the socialists themselves. But he's in his first term in office, he very much was branded the president of the rich because of his business-friendly policies. And he came across as somebody who was not interested in the grievances of ordinary people that are primarily worried about the cost of living, for example. So that allowed the extreme left and the extreme right to capitalize on those very important issues and led to the surge of those parties.
Yeah, really, really interesting results there. Nabila Ramdani, thank you so much for talking us through them. A really, really interesting conversation there. Appreciate your time this morning.